Let us now pray. O Almighty God, as we have come together to begin our meeting of the Assembly, we humbly beseech you to grant to all of our members the light and guidance of your Holy Spirit, that we may wisely take counsel together and come to such decisions as shall promote your glory and the well-being of all our citizens in this our land, so that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be enjoyed by all people. Grant this for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Announcements by the presiding officer.
Members, it is both my duty and honor to welcome you to the first sitting of the 10th session of the Tobago House of Assembly, which by law must take place within 15 days of the inauguration, as witnessed on January the 26th, 2017. It has been 4 years since this chamber has been graced with the combination of majority and minority members that emphasizes the democratic principles upon which our parliament was created, and by extension, this assembly. In this context, it is my responsibility to encourage you to engage in spirited debates within the confines of the rules provided for by the standing orders of this assembly. I wish to specially welcome distinguished guests, teachers, and students. Your role here is also important in educating yourselves to take part in the larger debate towards our democracy. Dr. Williams' statements in his independence speech of August 1962 as his first speech as Prime Minister is still relevant today, and perhaps more so today as we start this new term in reminding all of us of our roles. And I wish to quote, "The ordinary citizen must recognize the role of the Parliament in our democracy and must learn to differentiate between a member of Parliament, whom he or she may like or dislike, and the respect that must be accorded to that same member of Parliament ex officio. I call on all citizens from now on to accord the highest respect our Parliament system and institutions and to our Parliament itself. Democracy, finally, rests on a higher power than Parliament. It rests on an informed and cultivated, alert public opinion. The members of Parliament are only representatives of the citizens. They cannot represent apathy and indifference. They can play the part allotted to them only if they represent intelligence and public spiritness. Nothing has so demonstrated in the past 6 years the capacity of the people of Trinidad and Tobago than their remarkable interest in the public affairs. The development and expansion of that interest is the joint responsibility of the government, the Parliament, the political parties, and relevant civic organizations," unquote. Today, I am heartened to see you here as part of the public interest and your continued interest, therefore, in furthering democracy as a pivotal platform in the development of our country. I urge you to continue attending the settings throughout the session, and I wish for all of us a productive 10th session of this assembly. At this time, I wish to take the opportunity to present the letters of appointment to the councillors as the clerk calls their names.
Mrs. Lady Stewart. Assembly laws brought back from Parliament. Petitions tabled.
Seem to be having some technical difficulty with the microphone, so can you please just
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I have the privilege of taking the following papers in this honorable house. The House of Assembly monthly report at the end of October 2016. The House of Assembly monthly report at the end of September 2016. As well as the House of Assembly monthly report at the end of November 2016.
Presentation of reports from Dispute Resolution Commission, Select Committee. Questions to Secretary. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Assembly on definite matters of urgent public interest.
Member for Parliament, Member for Palatuvia, Lansme, Speyside.
Madam Presiding Officer, I wish to table before the House the following motion for consideration. Whereas the absence of a reliable cargo ferry service has continuously had crippling and deleterious effects on all commercial activity in Tobago, and whereas a wide cross-section of Tobagonians, including participants of the construction industry, distributors, wholesalers and retailers, market vendors, and consumers wishing to purchase food use this service, and whereas the operating cargo vessel is due to leave the country's shores shortly with no reliable alternative set in place in which any Tobagonian can reprove confidence, be it resolved that this House strongly condemns the flagrant disregard of Tobago's critical need for all the things that a reliable cargo boat facilitates. Be it further resolved that this House immediately sets up a working committee to see to immediate establishment of a proper service owned and controlled by the Assembly.
Member for Parliament, for Palatuvia, Lansme, Speyside, your request under Standing Order number 20, subsection 1, has been considered under the guidance of Standing Order 20, subsection 2. And whilst I agree that the matter is of public importance, I'm sure you would agree that it is not as defined within the orders being urgent or specific enough in nature as read. And therefore, your request has been denied, and I would like to suggest that you do have a day for a private member's motion as guided within the standing orders where you can table this motion.
Reform Assistant Secretary. Personal explanation. Introduction of bills.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, today is quite an historic day for me. In the not too distant past, Madam Presiding Officer, I would have sat where you are now sitting, and I would have been calling on members of the House to make their contributions. As fate would have it, you are now calling on me to make my contribution. And what is significant is that it is my maiden contribution, and more fundamentally, is a contribution that deals with the whole question of code of conduct. So it is a pleasure, Madam Presiding Officer, that I stand to move the motion standing in my name. Whereas at present, there is no specific code of conduct for members of the Tobago House of Assembly, and whereas members of the Tobago House of Assembly or this House have a responsibility to engage in conduct that will not bring the House into odium and disrepute, and whereas members of this House are likely to be subjected to greater scrutiny by members of the public with respect to the governance process of our island, be it resolved that this House appoint a special select committee to prepare a code of conduct for consideration and approval, and be it further resolved that this committee reports to the House no later than May 2017, and be it further resolved that this committee comprises 3 members of the majority and 2 members of the minority, and that it be chaired by the leader of Assembly business. Madam Presiding Officer, a cursory examination of our parliamentary system of government, and indeed our political culture, suggests that there is need for intervention. We do not have to look far, Madam Presiding Officer, to recognize that in respect of the behaviors of some of our parliamentarians, those behaviors are less than acceptable. And indeed, for those of us who from time to time would tune in to look at the parliament of other countries, we would also recognize that there are times when the behavior of members of those parliaments would have descended almost into views on radio, Facebook, etc., and the community at large point to the fact that the standard of conduct of those who have the responsibility to provide leadership at all levels, but more particularly at the level of the political leadership, must set the tone. In fact, Madam Presiding Officer, in respect of the expectations of the Tobago electorate, and also in respect of the standards of conduct and ethical behavior of politicians, the gauge is pointing upwards. In other words, the expectations are rising. And it is in this context, Madam Presiding Officer, that we felt it particularly important, almost compelling, to place this motion for debate at the first sitting of this House, this Honorable House. Because indeed, we have the opportunity at this time to set both the pace and the tone for what happens over the next 4 years. We must lead by example. We must never be those who believe that you must do as I say, but not as I do. We, on this side, state unequivocally that for us, example is better than precept. We are at the place, Madam Presiding Officer, where in setting the pace, we are in fact sitting on the threshold of history. As was stated in part of the preamble to the motion, at this time, there is an absence of such a code. so that notwithstanding the length of time that the Tobago House of Assembly has been in existence, there has never been a time when we would have been guided by a code of conduct. So in a very real sense, those of us who sit around the table today, those of us in this honorable house, are part of this history-making event. And indeed, our contributions, those of us who are going to contribute to this motion, will in fact be indelibly etched, not only in the records of the Hansard, but in the minds and hearts of those of us who are listening and looking on. And Madam Presiding Officer, today ought to mark in a very real sense a kind of renaissance, a kind of reawakening, a rebirth of those critical values that in a very real sense define the Tobagonian personality of some time ago. You know, Madam Presiding Officer, Trinidad and Tobago has been fortunate on the one hand, but of course there have been consequences, unintended as those may be, in respect of that level of fortune. We have been privileged to enjoy the fruits of our petroleum sector, but we have, in doing so, suffered from what is normally referred to as the Dutch disease, in that affluence did breed much effluence. And therefore, as part of that breeding, we would have seen deterioration of standards across the board, a lowering of the values and the morals of our society, to the point where the view would have been expressed, and not by an insignificant number of persons, that we were on a downward slide into moral decadence. So as I'm saying, Madam Presiding Officer, we are at the point where we can, in fact, engender and generate the kind of reawakening that the society on the whole calls for today. And so, Madam Presiding Officer, in respect of the motion before us, a code of conduct basically specifies certain rules for behavior or standards to which one's behavior must comply. And in that context, what happens is that there is a reduction in one's discretion. Madam Presiding Officer, in a very real sense, those of us here today as members of this honorable house are in effect public officers. As you undoubtedly are aware, Madam Presiding Officer, the Integrity Act defines every one of us here as a person in public life. And indeed, a person in public life, as we are, is in effect a public officer. And therefore, as members, we sit in legislative authority, albeit limited legislative authority. As you know, Act 40 of 1996 does in fact limit the ability of this honorable house to pass laws. But there is a measure of legislating function. There is a budget making and approval function. And of course, in the main, there is a policy making function. As such, Madam Presiding Officer, as public officers, we must at all times act in the best interests of the people of Tobago and the island of Tobago on a whole. As public officers, Madam Presiding Officer, there is a fiduciary, moral, and ethical relationship with the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly those citizens that are residing in Tobago, and on whose behalf we act. As well, Madam Presiding Officer, the point must be made very forcefully that we are entrusted with the responsibility to protect and uphold the common interests of all of our residents. That is to say, we must put the public interest above all others, including our own, first. We must be island and community focused rather than individual focused. Madam Presiding Officer, furthermore, as members of the Assembly, our behavior should reflect favorably on the reputation of this Assembly and this House. And in fact, it must also reflect, strengthen, and promote the Assembly as an institution. We must never, as stated in the preamble, take actions or engage in behaviors that bring this House, Honorable House, into odium and disrepute. Because you know, Madam Presiding Officer, there is a relationship between our behavior in this House, or our conduct in this House, and the risk to the reputation of this august body or institution. And if ever behaviors descend, then to that extent, the reputation of this organization, this institution, will be placed under pressure. In that regard, we are likely to lose faith with the electorate or the residents of Tobago, because they would lose respect for those of us who sit around this House. And Madam Presiding Officer, there are some questions that one may well ask at this time. Some of these questions undoubtedly are, what are the options available for improving the conduct of assemblymen? What is the purpose of a specific code of conduct? Are codes of conduct the most effective mechanisms to, one, improve the conduct of assemblymen, and B, increase the trust of citizens or electorate in those of us sitting here, both the majority and the minority? What features would be acceptable? And why is misconduct important in a democratic society? Those are some of the questions that I'm sure may be engaged in the minds of those of us who are here, and in respect of the wider community of Tobago, those who are tuned in. I submit, Madam Presiding Officer, that it would be difficult for anyone to argue legitimately that a code of conduct for members of this Assembly should not be adopted. A code of conduct represents a fundamentally important element in any program or any attempt to generate public trust and confidence, and to improve public perception of the Assembly and its members. Let me make it elusively clear, Madam Presiding Officer, that a code of conduct is not designed to control the behavior of members per se. Rather, it would be designed to, one, set public standards by which behavior of members of the Assembly, inclusive of those of us in this House, can be assessed. If we are to bequeath a society to our children and our children's children, a society in which peace and harmony, concord abounds, then we have a responsibility to create the environment and to leave such an environment in which all of our children can blossom. Two, it would be designed to provide a basis for assessing proposed actions and so guide behavior. It is not uncommon, Madam Presiding Officer, to hear persons speak in respect of the need for positive role models for our young persons. I'm saying to us today that those of us who are now leaders in this place or in this house have a responsibility to set that tone and, in fact, to behave like role models for our young people. 3, provide an agreed foundation for responding to behavior that is considered unacceptable. And therefore, what this does is that it eliminates subjectivity and promotes a certain kind of consistency in respect of assessment, evaluation, analysis. And finally, a code of conduct would seek to assure and reassure the people of Tobago that their trust in us is not misplaced. As a matter of fact, Madam Presiding Officer, given the situation that those of us who are now here would have been as a result of a response of the electorate, it says to a large measure that they are saying to us, principally to those of us on the majority side, that we have confidence in you. And we are providing you with the opportunity to continue to lead this island and to take it to another level. And therefore, you ought to do what is required so that at the end of the day, our faith in you is not misplaced. And that you don't let us down. I say, Madam Presiding Officer, through you, to the members of this Honorable House, that that is just what we are going to do. We will not let the people of Tobago down. A code of conduct, and the one in which I am sure at the end of the day will come back before this House, must be one that is balanced, in that it must be both aspirational on the one hand and prescriptive on the other. In that context, it ought to be characterized by clear guidelines, principles, injunctions, and prohibitions. The code must not only deal with conflicts of financial interest, for example, but must also deal with behavior of members that may tend to obstruct, undermine, or thwart the operation of this House or this legislature. It must also deal with issues relative to the abuse of the benefits, privileges, and position of members of this Honorable House, and actions that may otherwise bring into disrepute other members or the institution of itself must be frowned upon and must be outlined. Madam Presiding Officer, what needs to be said forcefully is that codes of conduct by themselves will not create honesty nor integrity. And we understand that. We understand that very, very clearly. But let's be clear about the fact, or for that matter, let us recognize that as individuals, our core personalities do not change. And therefore, we have a responsibility to see to what extent, if we are challenged in that respect, how we can moderate our behaviors. Because you know, Madam Presiding Officer, that one definition of personality is a consistent pattern of behavior. And therefore, we in this House must do some introspection to the extent that we are conscious of our core personalities and take the required actions to moderate those behaviors that may be inimical to the peace, order, and good conduct of operations, not only in this house, but outside of this house as well. Madam Presiding Officer, codes are not merely cudgels. In other words, they are not thick sticks that need to be used as weapons or clubs, but they ought to be seen as lights, as an illumination, allowing for a shining of the light on those attributes that are desirable. You know, Madam Presiding Officer, I probably do not go to church as often as I should. But I think somewhere in the Bible it is written that we ought to let our light so shine so that men shall see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. I commend that passage of Scripture today, Madam Presiding Officer, to those of us who are present in this august chamber. So that our code of conduct ought to have at least two purposes, significant purposes. One, a public purpose, and two, an institutional purpose. In respect of the latter, it must be a guide to behavior both inside and outside of this house, outside of this chamber, so that there is a particular kind of consistency. There's a particular kind of order, so that as we call upon the population to behave in particular ways, we can have the peace of mind knowing that there is legitimacy in such a call, because we are in fact living, or as we like to say, Madam Presiding Officer, we are in fact walking the talk. What we are asking to be done is what we ourselves are prepared to do. And in respect of the former, it seeks to inter alia, as I indicated earlier, facilitate an assessment or a benchmarking. In other words, so that the public would be able to judge behaviors that are acceptable and those that are unacceptable, as we seek to transform our island of Tobago, and to the extent that our island is characterized by behaviors that are unethical, especially when it comes to the issue of governance. To that extent, we can reflect and take the actions required to change course. And finally, in that respect, in respect of what I'm just speaking about, to ensure the promotion of trust in the institutions as well as the members who occupy this house. Madam Presiding Officer, would you be so kind? I would have lost track of the time. How much time do I have still? Thank you. I shall now turn, Madam Presiding Officer, to some basic principles which ought to underlie the establishment of an acceptable code of conduct. And in this regard, I refer to a document, recommended benchmarks for codes of conduct, a publication from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And some of the principles that are outlined here are as follows. Members shall behave according to the following principles. Selflessness. Members of the Assembly should act solely in terms of the public interest. Integrity. Members of the Assembly must avoid placing themselves under any obligation to people or organizations that may try inappropriately to influence them in their work. In other words, They should not act or take decisions in order to gain financial or other material benefits for themselves, their families, or their friends. And in that regard, they have a duty to declare and resolve any interests and relationships. Objectivity is another principle. And the view is that members must act and take decisions impartially, fairly, and on merit, using the best evidence and without discrimination or bias. Accountability. Members are accountable to the public for their decisions and actions and must submit themselves to the scrutiny necessary to ensure this. Openness. Members should act and take decisions in an open and transparent manner. Information should not be withheld from the public unless there are clear and lawful reasons for so doing. Honesty. Significant. Members ought to be truthful. I know, Madam Presiding Officer, that in the cut and thrust of what is called the politics, there may be the temptation to score political points. I think we have, again, a responsibility, notwithstanding, to even in our attempt to score political points, to remain faithful to what is true and what is the truth. Leadership. Members should exhibit these principles in their own behavior. And that underscores the point I made earlier in respect of example being better than precept. They should actively promote and robustly support the principles and be willing to challenge poor behavior wherever it occurs. And even as I say that, in quoting again, the document makes reference to acting in good conscience, respecting the intrinsic dignity of all, act so as to merit the trust and respect of the community, and to give effect to the ideas of democratic government, and abide by the letter and spirit of the Constitution, and uphold the separation of powers and the rule of law. You would recall, Madam Presiding Officer, that you were present on the 26th of January when we all took that solemn oath to uphold the Constitution and the law. And there's a reason why we were required to take that oath, because taking that oath, as it were, strengthens the social contract between those of us who went to the people and would have been provided by the people with the opportunity to be their leaders. And we must exercise the privileges and discharge the duties of public office diligently and with civility, dignity, care, and honor. I think, Madam Presiding Officer, that captures, in essence, some of the principles that I said should underlie the establishment of a code of conduct. And may I say, Madam Presiding Officer, that what is happening here today in respect of this motion represents, in a very real sense, keeping the faith with the people. Because those of us who were following, when I decided that I would respond to the wishes of the people, and I started my campaign, my internal campaign, one of the things that I said is that if I were to be successful, that one of my first acts would have been to institute a code of conduct for secretaries and members of the Assembly. and indeed it is, in respect of the policy position emanating out of this honorable House, my very first act. In reviewing some of the literature, Madam Presiding Officer, it became clear to me that in respect of an attempt at enforcing a code of conduct, that there are at least three broad approaches. One has to do with the use of legislation, and that is in itself creating a body external to and independent of or from the legislature to be responsible for enforcement, oversight, etc. And examples of this approach one can find in Alberta and Ontario, Canada, and in New South Wales. The other is to establish within the legislature a body that oversees the conduct of members, and those institutions that derive their model of governance from the United Kingdom in the main do that, because even in respect of the Tobago House of Assembly, there is a privileges committee which has the responsibility to treat with some of those issues. And thirdly, there is the option of where discipline is internal to the legislature and is based upon a detailed set of rules and guidelines. There is considerable detail in the codes and rules. I'm not so sure, Madam Presiding Officer, that that would be appropriate. An example is in the United States Congress, because, for example, a gift rule adopted on the 7th of December 1995 was accompanied by a 10-page explanatory note. So you can well imagine. So, Madam Presiding Officer, as I wind up, in respect of the presentation of the motion, I wish to appeal to all of us that for those of us who would really like to see the development of Tobago and the development of Tobago in a particular context, that we have a responsibility to support this motion. In that regard, Madam Presiding Officer, I beg to move.
Members, the question is, whereas at present there is no specific code of conduct for members of the Tobago House of Assembly, and whereas members of this House have a responsibility to engage in conduct that will not bring the House into odium and disrepute, and whereas members of this House are likely to be subjected to greater scrutiny by members of the public with respect to the governance process of our island, be it resolved that this House appoint a special select committee to prepare a code of conduct for consideration and approval. Be it further resolved that this committee report to the House no later than May 2017. And be it further resolved that this committee comprise 3 members of the majority and 2 members of the minority, and that it be chaired by the leader of Assembly business. Member for Roxborough, telephone.
All right. Organize. And thank you, Honorable Chief Secretary Kelvin Charles. Madam Presiding Officer, I stand on my feet today as the Chief Secretary of Assemblyman for SWAM. I was spoken a while ago to make my maiden speech. And I was once outside, looking on to the tube at what was taking place on the inside. And certainly, I felt for a moment, as my colleague have expressed, the need for a code of conduct. I must admit, I'm in agreement with him on the fact that for the last 4 years, what was demonstrated in the House of Assembly required a code of conduct. But I'm consoled by the fact that when the Honorable Assemblyman spoke, he spoke about parliamentarians misbehaving themselves. He spoke nothing about assemblymen misbehaving themselves. He also spoke about the need to reduce one's discretion in conducting themselves. And so this code becomes important. It becomes like the steel barriers you use along the highway to constrain people from destroying themselves. He sees a code of conduct like that. And I said, perhaps yes. But nowhere did he make mention of the fact that for the last 4 years, the Tobago House of Assembly needed one. I hold in my hand a very prized book, Standing Orders of the Tobago House of Assembly. And I dare to read the first page for my friend on the next side, Madam Presiding Officer. Standing Orders, I trust the House has been so kind to give him one, Madam Presiding Officer. It says Standing Orders of the Tobago House of Assembly, made by the Tobago House of Assembly under Section 69 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act 1996. That's just a reference point. Amended 2015. This good book was amended. I took the time out to peruse this book quite meticulously. I took my time studying every page with great intent because I wanted to see how this house would be regulated. And I must say, I found a storehouse of information as regarding to one's behavior and one's conduct in the House of Assembly. For instance, Madam Presiding Officer, I invite my friend on the next side, Assemblyman for SWAM, my good Chief Secretary, friend, Kelvin Charles. I invite him, if he has one of these books, perhaps he could look. Under Standing Order 42, he spoke about time and the manner of speaking. It guides you. It tells you how much time you have to speak, how to go about speaking. You have to give notice, the order of speaking. These things are never left to chance in the Tobago House of Assembly. This is a well-written book. It guides one behavior. Yes, in the simple of task, nothing is left to chance inside here. One's conduct is well regulated by these standing orders. If one was to go to Standing Order 44, Standing Order 44, and I want to take my time as I turn the pages, lest anyone think I'm speaking from my memory. Even though I can, I will not rely upon it because the book is the authority that I rely upon today. You see, there are times when people, Madam Presiding Officer, they read books and they don't know how the story ends. And so they start talking about the book. But these codes of conduct have been tried in large countries and it has failed miserably. People don't read them. And it seldom improves the behavior of anyone because they are guided by legislation rather than the oration or some document that someone creates. Standing Order 44 tells you not to interrupt people. Like I'm feeling threatened that my colleagues are next are trying to interrupt me. See, they're laughing loudly. I could hardly hear myself on this side. But it speaks about interruptions. Those on the next side should not do anything to interrupt those on this side. But they don't practice what they preach, Madam Presiding Officer. But they love to preach. They know chapter, but they don't know verse, Madam Presiding Officer. This is the trouble we have on this side. My colleagues and I The minority bench, we have a trouble. While he spoke, I listened intently. He's busy telling secrets on the side, Madam Presiding Officer. I feel as if I'm talking to myself. I believe I'm talking to myself, Madam Presiding Officer. But I will plead your protection whenever it's necessary for me to do so, Madam Presiding Officer. I know you will protect this house and you will regulate the conduct of persons within this house. Because there is a proclivity for my friends on the next side to be out of control and behave like raging bulls from time to time, especially when they are resisted. I don't know if it is a red that they are wearing sometimes that will infuriate them, but that's their behavior on that side, not on this side. So, Madam Presiding Officer, again, the standing orders are very clear. They're on target. They speak about interruptions. They also speak, if you go to standing order 45, about the content of one speech. I listened to the whole speech a while ago and I was wondering what was the content of it. If it was really on the subject. They spoke about all different type of behavior, this and that, and I was wondering, what is the reason for the code of conduct? I never got any reason. But the content of one speech is regulated by this. It says here, a member shall confine his observations to the subject under discussion. Why do we need a code of conduct, Madam Presiding Officer? Why do we need one? Why is it so urgent? Why is it so pressing? I mean, nothing is wrong with a code of conduct, but I think that is best focus in the right direction. Right outside these walls, there are people who are unregulated. They're unregulated because those who have been charged with the responsibility of creating policy for the population at large in Tobago have abandoned their responsibility insofar as providing the nation with a crime plan. So people are walking up and down and are doing what they want outside. There's a need for one to taper their behavior. I understand that. But I say, it may not be inside this house at this point in time. Just today, I know that people have a way sometimes to deteriorate in behavior. Car was stolen in broad daylight. Broad daylight, garden side. Just today, a man was shot in his leg. So there's definitely a need for a code of conduct, Madam Presiding Officer. There's definitely a need. But I see not urgently needed inside here. The misconduct is outside, not inside here. I'm concerned that my friend tried to misrepresent what goes on inside these august and honorable chambers, as if people inside here were like wild Apache running up and down with axe trying to kill someone or trying to hurt people inside here. I'm concerned. When you ask them, how do you intend to regulate society for which you have signed up for? The work that you aspired to and achieved, they throw their hands in the air and say they have no crime plan. They have no plan to regulate society. That comes from Trinidad. But ask Trinidad. Trinidad is unregulated. No code of conduct. None. I see the standing orders is very good for me at this point in time and for my colleagues. So 45 speak about the content of one speech, how it must stay on the subject. And if you are trying to propose the reason for a code of conduct, one will expect those reasons to be strong, to be reasons that are not now addressed. Not to hear flippant reasons as example is better than precept. What is that? Where that came from? Shakespeare? Example is better than precept. He referred, my good friend on that side referred to the Integrity Act, or Integrity in Public Life Act, which is another set of rules, and my honorable friend, Brother Augustine Fall, he will rise and will speak about that to a great extent just now, because some of my colleagues have not been reading, they have been too new, they have been admiring the plushness of their office, Honorable, presiding officer. They have been admiring, sitting in the couch, spinning around as some are now doing, rocking from side to side, swinging their feet. Maybe a code of conduct is required for that. On the side, swinging side to side, not focus, enjoying the luxury of office. Maybe they require that. A good friend speak about odium and disrespect. Those are powerful words, and indeed, we on this side, Madam Presiding Officer, we on this side, we on the minority bench, we have felt the true meaning of the word odium and disrespect coming from the other side. They have felt that, Madam. So it's a code of conduct that they need to control. I'm speaking about, they need to control that. When you are now elected into office, all of us, we got our oath the same day. All of us are serving this honorable house. All of us represented Tobago House of Assembly at different levels doing different tasks. But when those on this side, the minority side, we are given no offices, no staff to work with, nothing whatsoever, not even an assembly sticker to stick on a car and look posh, nothing at all whatsoever. And they come here and they still want to deal with code of conduct as if someone was misbehaving themselves. I say perhaps the solution can best be found by Michael Jackson's words. Deal with the man in the mirror. I will say that. And if they could see on this back of this phone, they might see a reflection of who they have to deal with. We go on further in these standing orders because I really spent some time combing through these meticulously. Standing order 50. Limit the time to which one speak. And I want to ask, like my good friend asked a while ago, Madam Presiding Officer, for a time check. Because I'm not seeing the time check on the wall. If you're so kind, Madam Presiding Officer, how much time do I have?
12 minutes left.
How much?
12.
12 minutes. Thank you, that's a lot of time. I appreciate that. I have a lot more to say. When one look at standing order 49, there are particular rules for members who are not speaking on the order paper. I want to take some time and read that. A member present in the assembly during debate shall, and that's for those who are listening to the tube, they may never have the chance to read a book as this, and they may say, you know, perhaps what my friend is asking for on that side is a good thing. Maybe they really need some behavior. Maybe they're ready to control some bad behavior too. But every bad behavior that could be conceived was thought of in this book and has been properly addressed in this book. So standing order 49 says, a member present in the assembly during a debate shall enter or leave the assembly with decorum. You know how to leave the assembly. Behavior. Maintain silence while another member is speaking. My friends on that side have trouble doing that. They are talking, they are swerving in the chairs. Maybe they need the code of conduct for themselves, Madam Presiding Officer. It says that. It's here. I read it. My honorable friend, you can read it too if you have some time. Standing order 49. He says, otherwise conduct himself in a fit and proper manner. Very clear. You can't get more clear than this. So it worries us on this side. What is so pressing about this motion? What is so pressing? And I just want to repeat again for some of my friends who has a temptation to speak. I want to read to them the standing orders here. It's a member not speaking and not signed up to speak at all. It's supposed to remain silent during these sittings here. It says maintain silence while another member is speaking. These rules, I love these rules. Anything better than this, spoil. My partner, my friend on this side, he likes to use statements like example better than precept. I will use a local one. Anything better than these standing orders, spoil. I could rely on these. As a matter of fact, the last THA executive that was here, headed by his colleague, Honorable Mr. Over London, he had no trouble at all with these. He ruled for the last 16 years without ever creating a code of conduct. My friend has not even ruled for a week yet. Not even a week. But he's on the side talking about code of conduct. I don't know what type of hellish behavior he has seen or discovered among his colleagues, but he wants to control it. I understand that. And so today, we on this side are saying we have no problem with our code of conduct, but we are saying it is not urgent, and because it is not urgent, we are not prepared on this side to subject ourselves to those trivial issues at this point in time. Maybe 6 months down the road, maybe a year from now, we could deal with my colleague across the issues. But on this side, we are saying there are more pressing issues as crime. There are more pressing issues as the boat. These are things we need to treat with. Just today I read a letter, Madam Presiding Officer, that came from a permanent secretary. And he's talking about people conduct. They would have written the chairman of the Tobago Chamber of Commerce, Debbie Cruikshank, last year, May 31st, telling him that a contract for the Superfast Galicia has already been prepared and is only awaiting signature. However, I'm being disturbed, ma'am, by the next side. Could you please tell members of the next side to control themselves, please? I'm speaking. They are adjusting across their manners. Honorable Presiding Officer, please protect me from members on that side.
Member for Roxborough Delaford, can you please proceed with your presentation?
See, Madam Speaker, we have to put up it on this side. Distractions. Maybe like football, they should mark the time, record it, and give it back. Foul play. Pure foul play. Going on the next side. And that is what I agree should be controlled by the code of conduct. And so this person would have given the assurance that a contract has been prepared for the boat, only to find out 2-3 months later when they inquired from the minister if the contract has been prepared, none was prepared. These are things we need to regulate in public life, of course. There must be a code of conduct, but not now. We are saying not now. Let the code of conduct take the cue and wait in order of precedence. Maybe sometime 6 months down the road. And I wonder now, as I close, Honorable, if this is what the Honorable Chief Secretary is coming with, the Honorable Assemblyman for SWAM is coming with, at the first sitting, and if this is the priority, I ask myself, what is to come in the next one? I rest my seat. Madam, I take my seat. Madam Presiding Officer.
Secretary of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I must say, Madam Presiding Officer, again, it is a pleasure. This is my maiden speech in this August House as well. And if at any time I wondered, Madam Presiding Officer, that it may have been necessary for a working session on the standing orders, I notice it's no longer important because the member for Roxborough Delaford would have certainly afforded us with one. And I'm thankful, Madam Presiding Officer, that he did reference Shakespeare because as a former English teacher, and I'm sure the member for Palliative Speyside would also appreciate it, I would like to refer to some Shakespeare. That it should come to this, and that is taken from Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 2. That it should come to this. And what Hamlet was speaking about, Madam Presiding Officer, is the fact that around him, his beloved country was going down a path of decadence, a path that he was not comfortable with. And he realized that the time had come that change had to happen. And he recognized that change had to happen at the head. Thus, the introduction, Madam Presiding Officer, of the concept of the body politic. The body politic, and again, the member for Palliative Care Speyside would appreciate this. The body politic meaning that as long as the head is in good order, the rest of the body will follow suit. And I say today, Madam Presiding Officer, it seems like we need a lesson. And I would like to refer to the CPA document again that was brought by the Honorable Chief Secretary. And it seems I will have to afford the other members copies of this document so we understand the roles or the role of a code of conduct as opposed to the standing orders. And Madam Presiding Officer, if I may, a code of conduct forms an important part of the integrity system. Integrity system. If we do not have a need for integrity in this August House, what do we really need? If that is not considered as important, then what is important? Integrity is of paramount importance. I stand here today, and I dare to say I stand in the presence of what I may have called giants. I remember, Madam Presiding Officer, as a young boy, my father taking me to the library downstairs. For those of you who may remember that the library was downstairs. As a matter of fact, I will take you further when my grandfather was downstairs giving art classes. And I remember looking at the members of this August House and wondering, look at those giants. Look at those men and women who represent us, represent our people. And I dare say, and as I was telling the Honorable Chief Secretary earlier, I only recognize today that I'm the third generation of Devines to be here in this house. And I take that responsibility seriously because I recognize immediately the importance for us to stand as giants for our community, for Tobago to see us, to be proud of us, to take pattern from us. So I say again, Madam Presiding Officer, if now is not the time to resume, as the Honorable Chief Secretary has mentioned, start bringing back those Tobagonian characteristics and principles, when will that time be? If now is not the time to bring back a sense of ethics in our community, when will that time be? I dare say, Madam Presiding Officer, now has to be the time. Now has to be the time that we stand up and recognize our responsibility as members of this August House to lead Tobago into a new and renewed future. Now is the time, Madam Presiding Officer, that members of this August House ask themselves, why? Why are we here today? Why will we be here for the next 4 years? We're not here to rock in our chairs. We are not here to grand charge like raging bulls. We are not here to drive about or get fancy stickers to put on our cars or complain about our offices or lack thereof. We are here to serve the people of Tobago. So, Madam Presiding Officer, if a code of conduct is what we need to ensure that there's a higher level of accountability, that the people of Tobago can hold us to task and say, listen, this is what I expect of my representative, then we have a problem. We have all campaigned for weeks about accountability and integrity in public office. Yet at the first opportunity, we start shirking and cowering from that responsibility. Madam Presiding Officer, if I may beg your indulgence, on Monday, I went to my village council meeting in Mariah, and I was hoping to just resume my duties as the PRO of the village council. Mariah, a village that I love, that I was born, grew in Mariah. And I sat there hoping that I would be recognized as the PRO of the Mariah Village Council, a village council that I was instrumental in ensuring was rejuvenated. Madam Presiding Officer, I could not be seen as such. I was seen as the Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries, and the Environment. I was no longer the PRO even within the village council. Madam Presiding Officer, Junior Chamber International, an international organization of active young citizens in over 100 countries across the world. I have the privilege of serving as the national president for JCI West Indies. I went to a meeting of JCI Tobago on Thursday, and I was not recognized as such. I am no longer the president of JCI West Indies. I am the Secretary for Infrastructure, Quarries, and the Environment. And whenever I speak in public, Madam Presiding Officer, I represent the entire assembly, each and every one of us. And we cannot take that responsibility lightly, Madam Presiding Officer. We must recognize that we must be of the crowd, but not in the crowd. We must know that we are here to serve our people, work with our people, but it does not mean we have to descend to behaviors that surround us sometimes. And dare I say, Madam Presiding Officer, there are times I'm driving about Tobago and I'm hurt. I'm hurt because I'm a lover of the environment. I am hurt because I believe in a clean, green, and serene Tobago, and a safe Tobago as well. And Madam Presiding Officer, the lack of respect for environment. People are throwing things out of their windows. They prefer their cars to be clean than the environment around them to be clean. And we are beginning to accept these things as society. Now is the time to pull it back in. And we have to set the example from right here where we sit. We have to let the people of Tobago now know it is not business as usual, it is business unusual. And we have to ensure, Madam Presiding Officer, that we go down the road of showing, as the Honorable Chief Secretary would have said, we are not just here to do as I say and not as I do. We must lead by example. It is time for us to build an ethical culture, a culture that is not foreign to many of us. I don't know if all of us. But we must regain those principles that the Honorable Chief Secretary spoke about. We must lean heavily on the principles of selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. We cannot take these principles for granted, Madam Presiding Officer. Now is the time. Now is the time. As I stand here, I stand proudly to say a code of conduct is necessary to take away that level of sometimes we are unsure. Should we or shouldn't we? We cannot just leave it up to everyone's whims, fancies, and interpretation anymore. We must be very clear in what we are doing. We have entered an age where people are looking at us now more than ever. The information age is here. We cannot hide behind secrecy or ignorance in any kind of way. We have to recognize that our young people are looking on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the television. They are looking at us now. Now is the time. We cannot ignore the fact that we must move forward in a different way of operation. And I say to you, Madam Presiding Officer, that I have absolutely no challenge in ensuring that we have a code of conduct. As a matter of fact, I have in my possession a file, and I will share it with the minority when we have the opportunity. Madam Presiding Officer, if I may. These two files contain code of conducts from across the world, including Grenada. We have the Deputy Presiding Officer of the Senate here with us. And he, thank you very much for your corrections, the Deputy President of the Senate here with us. And he has been an active member of the CPA. And we have to understand that our responsibility as signatories and members of the CPA is to align ourselves with these international best practices, these benchmarks that are set. We have to now ensure that we align ourselves with as such. As the Honorable Chief Secretary said, Madam Presiding Officer, this is not a big stick. We don't need to hold a big stick to the member for palliative care and Speyside. I'm sure even as a teacher he would recognize that there are other methods, and we have adopted other methods of ensuring proper conduct in our schools. Corporal punishment was banned, but it does not mean that we don't have codes or rules in place. And the difference between the standing orders, which are primarily rules of procedure, and it seems not everyone is aware of that. The difference between the code of conduct and the standing orders. The standing orders tell us what we need to do in the house. How we conduct ourselves is important in public life. No longer are we the presidents of any associations. Whenever we stand before anyone, we address them as secretary for this, honorable chief secretary for that, member for the other. We have to recognize that we have a responsibility, and I implore the young and new members, especially in this house, to ensure that we hold everyone to account. And I was spoken to the member for palliative care Speyside on many occasions, even before we ended up in this situation, about the fact that we are the future. And he would agree with me, and I'm sure he would continue to agree with me as we go further together. I challenge the member for Speyside palliative care, get your colleagues on board. We need a code of conduct to ensure that we are accountable to our people. Let the people know what the standards that we abide by, the standards that we are going to continue to ensure we stand with. We need to ensure, Honorable Member for Speyside, palliative care Speyside, that we work together. Honorable Member for palliative care Speyside, we must work together, Madam Presiding Officer. My apologies. So, Madam Presiding Officer, if I may, refer to a document, a guide for parliamentarians from the Global Task Force on Parliamentary Ethics. And they speak about the regulatory framework for a code of conduct. And I quote, "A legislative code of conduct is a formal document which regulates the behavior of legislators by establishing what is considered to be acceptable behavior and what is not. In other words, it is intended to create a political culture which places considerable emphasis on propriety, correctness, transparency, and honesty of the parliamentarians' behavior. However, the code of conduct is not intended to create this behavior itself. It means, Madam Presiding Officer, that it's up to us here in this august house, this honorable house, to ensure that once a code of conduct is in place, that we work together and we set the standards. And we set the standards that we want to spread to all of Tobago. You know, I know some good fishermen, Madam Presiding Officer, and they always say, They always say the fish are the best fish that there is. And there's a saying that the fish may rot from the head. We have to ensure that this fish stays fresh from the head. The head, our governance here in Tobago, we need to ensure that we set a strong ethical and conduct regime that can transcend the entire of Tobago. And Madam Presiding Officer, we must ensure that we set the tone. And we set the tone from minute one. And at 3:01 p.m., Madam Presiding Officer, on this very day, the 9th of February, 2017, I say again, I submit that now is the time to stand on the principles that I would have mentioned before. And I must commend, Madam Presiding Officer, again, the Honorable Chief Secretary, a man of his word. A man of his word. He said, even before knowing what the date of the internal election may have been, he said, without even knowing what the date of the Tobago House of Assembly elections would have been, he said, without even knowing who the members of the House would have been, that I am going to ensure that there's a code of conduct for all members of the Assembly. And we are here today, Madam Presiding Officer, to ensure that that happens. Madam Presiding Officer, as I seek to rest, not my seat, I would like to leave, as my Honorable Chief Secretary did mention, maybe I don't attend church as often as I should have, but I made a fresh start on Sunday, and I'm so inspired. And let me share with the honorable members from Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 to 9. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Thank you, Madam President.
Member for Palatuvia, Lansumi Speyside.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. It is indeed a privilege to stand in this house as a real member of this house. In fact, Madam Presiding Officer, as I sat there and I think back to the first time I entered these chambers, it was somewhere between 2001 and 2003, perhaps 2002. And I entered this house to serve as a mock assemblyman in this house. And today, as I sat here, it dawned on me that I'm actually sitting in the same seat I sat at that time. And so I am inordinately grateful for this privilege. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to represent a constituency that most people would have forgotten. A constituency, no doubt, that has been forgotten by my predecessors. And so I join this debate, notwithstanding some difficulties I have with the debate in and of itself, with motion in and of itself. I join this debate and I see this as a privilege. I wish to begin, Madam Presiding Officer, by indicating that this motion, as it is really superfluous. And what do I mean by being superfluous? It means that it is redundant to a large extent, and it is also unnecessary in other areas. Why do I say that? Because when I look at this call for a code of conduct, and I listen to some of the elements that are desired for this code of conduct, then I find all of those things as mentioned by the Honorable Chief Secretary and by Councillor Devines, I find them in other existing legislation in Trinidad and Tobago. So ideally, what we ought to do is just become law-abiding citizens. And if we are law-abiding citizens, then we will be meeting the objectives as proposed by this motion. If we pull the Integrity in Public Life Act, and we go to Part 4, for example, there is a code of conduct established in the Integrity in Public Life Act. And this act talks about, in Part 4, talks about the use of the office. How do you use your office? It speaks to insider information. It speaks to how you use your influence. It speaks to gifts. It speaks to confidentiality, conflict of interest, and a number of areas that we would have seen being flaunted, being broken quite openly these last 4 years. And so I am surprised that a code of conduct has surfaced as our first motion. But then given who is the national political leader of the members opposite, I'm also not surprised, because perhaps the code of conduct needs to be established within political parties, starting with the members opposite, as opposed to in this House. More than that, Madam Presiding Officer, the Honorable Chief Secretary spoke to the need for an intervention. He spoke about the fact, and I say it's a fact, that the public has high expectations and that the public is demanding more from us. You know why the public is demanding more from us? The public is demanding more from us because we have seen time and time again that we have many members who are really lawbreakers. And it is not that we need another law or another policy to govern how people behave. What we need is for people to simply observe and practice the laws of this land. If people are practicing the laws of this land, then we won't need a code of conduct to tell people that they can't give their girlfriend a house, public housing, because that is clear conflict of interest. If people observe the laws of this land, they will know that kickbacks is illegal, and that is code of conduct. If people observe the laws of this land, they will also know that they ought to conduct themselves with the use of their office in a manner that can make their constituents proud. And so it's not that we need more laws. What we need to do is observe those laws that exist. That's what we need to observe. In fact, Plato said it probably well. He said that good people don't need laws to tell them how to act responsibly. But he says something further. He said bad people will always find a way around the law. And so it is not a code of conduct that will really determine how we behave the next 4 years or the next 16 years, or for whatever duration this assembly stands, this institution stands. What will determine that is who we are, because it is either people have conduct or they don't have conduct, or it is either people choose to have conduct or they choose not to have conduct. And so no amount of passing a policy or a law is really going to change how people behave. I noticed quite humorously that most of us in this house, when we took our oath of office, most of us chose to swear using the Holy Scriptures. Today, I have noticed that we have been having scriptures quoting left, right, and center, and that's all well and good. But I found in the same scripture that Satan himself was able to take Jesus on top of a tall building and quote the very scriptures to Jesus. So I am not fooled by people who quote scriptures under the guise that somehow that means they have conduct. If you want to demonstrate good conduct, there is one way to do that. Live a life that has good conduct. Everybody here big and have sense. And so I don't think there is need for a law to do that. I don't think there is need to duplicate what exists in other laws, like the Integrity in Public Life Act, in order to engender good conduct among members of this House. The Honorable Chief Secretary pointed out some goals as established by the CPA document that he quoted from. He spoke about selflessness. Well, if you come into this House selfish, there's nothing we can write that will change that behavior. And so what the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, what those laws would have done is that those laws would have ensured that people should not be engaging in things like kickbacks, conflict of interest, giving all the contracts to your brother-in-laws and to your friends and your family. That is selfishness. And we don't need a new law to deal with that. We have laws that can already deal with that. Integrity was mentioned, and I was happy he spoke about financial gains. How interesting. The amount of people, assemblymen past, who have enriched themselves because of their position, because of their access, despite there being laws against that, says that we don't need another law. What we need is enforcing of the laws that exist. In fact, if the current Honorable Chief Secretary start doing a forensic audit and start locking up people for breaking the laws, that will be the best response and the best way of getting proper conduct from people. But until we become punitive in our actions, until we begin to drag people to the courthouse and ensure that justice rolls over, and ensure that a judging chamber tries those who have stolen from the THA, who have made this hallowed place less sanctimonious, then having a new code of conduct will not change people's behaviors. We have to become punitive in our actions. He spoke about declaration of interests. He spoke about objectivity. And we know that that's something that is hard to achieve based on human nature. And we know that in a political culture where nepotism and cronyism is rife, and you can't blame me for that culture. This is my first time in this House as a real assemblyman. I did nothing to contribute to that culture. And I submit that some of those who are championing this motion should begin to do some introspection themselves. And if they know that they are guilty, maybe they should go in the religious tone that we have this morning, stand and confess their sins. And then we will know that we are genuine about a code of conduct. He spoke about accountability, openness or transparency, honesty, leadership. And of course, all of these are admirable attributes. All of these things in some way or the other, we have tried through various pieces of legislation, through the central government, to regulate how people behave, how people in public life behave. And still, people in public life continue to misbehave. It means then that what we need is not an excluded document. What we need is for us to become more punitive and to address forcefully the people who misbehave. And I could tell you that I do agree somewhat with Councillor Devines. He spoke about as long as the head is good. I hope for his sake that his party now has a good head. Because if we can attribute so many flouting of the laws to previous incarnations of the THA, then it must be that the head we had was not good. And so we in this House must behave like adults. We in this House must observe all the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. we in this house must understand that we are living examples of the ideal. And whenever we break that down, we are saying to people that it is okay for them to misbehave. Whenever we in this house have tints, for example, on our cars that are unnecessarily dark and that breaks the law, then we are saying it's okay for others to do that too. When we in this house take back some money from people we give contracts to, we are saying it's okay to steal. When we in this house go around and lie, whether it's on the platform or whether it's in private, we are saying it's okay for people in the public to so behave. And all I'm saying this morning, Madam Presiding Officer, is that this motion is superfluous to the extent that there are other laws that actually meet the requirements of the code of conduct that is being called for. So it's not that we need a code of conduct, we need to simply observe the laws of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to close by saying this. I would have hoped that on day one of governance, that we would have had a party that was ready for governance. A majority that was ready for governance from day one. And the fact that on this small island, we have so many pressing issues, yet on our first motion is something that seeks to duplicate other laws, something that is superfluous, then it shows that we are not quite ready. Because let me be very frank, the people I represent who need proper roads, better housing, who need street lights, who don't have access to telecommunication, they don't care about this debate, you know. They care about food on their tables. They care about services reaching them. And so we need to move quickly, because my concern is that we waste time with these motions. We seek to embarrass each other as we bring these motions, and yet we get nothing productive done. Let's get productive. Madam Presiding Officer, if all of us observe all the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, then we don't need another code of conduct. I thank you.
Member for Bukumal Plaza.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. Of course, let me start by congratulating all the members of this House, particularly our new Chief Secretary of Tobago, Honorable Kelvin Charles, and of course, Minority Leader, other members of the minority, and all my colleagues on the majority side. I sincerely congratulate all of you for being elected to this August House. Let me congratulate you as well, Madam Presiding Officer, on your ascension to higher office. Today we are here discussing a code of conduct. And of course, the fact that we are here discussing this motion demonstrates that Chief Secretary Kelvin Charles is a man of his word. It demonstrates that Chief Secretary Kelvin Charles means to ensure that it will not be business as usual in the Tobago House of Assembly. And of course, the members of the other side went into great detail to school us on the standing orders and to school us on the Integrity in Public Life Act. But I think it's pretty obvious, Madam Presiding Officer, that the standing orders clearly speaks to how we conduct ourselves within this House, in terms of staying quiet when people talking, when other members are giving their contributions, in terms of how you should leave and enter the House, in terms of appropriate language during conversations within this House, etc., etc. And of course, the Integrity in Public Life Act, by the way, is law. It is part of our laws here in Trinidad and Tobago. And in some cases, there are strict sanctions, especially as it relates to declaring your interests and your assets, etc. I think false declarations and failure to declare results in imprisonment of up to, I think, 10 years in some cases. And therefore, that's the law. And we all know that there is an integrity commission. We all know about the perceived shortcomings of that commission. We know how long it takes for that commission to go through the processes if in fact they were to take action against any member in public life. And therefore, there is a need, obviously, for a code of conduct. Because we, the members of this House, Madam Presiding Officer, must be able to hold each other accountable. And I'm saying as well, accountability must start from the head. Because of course we are all aware of some of the issues here in Tobago. Issues, small issues, or issues that persons may consider to be small, such as a pothole to be fixed, a drain to be cleaned, etc., etc. And you will recognize that one of the fundamental issues we have here in Tobago, and in governance in general in Trinidad and Tobago, is a lack of accountability, a lack of persons taking responsibility. And therefore, this code of conduct is actually about improving accountability. It actually allows us, as members of this House, to be held accountable for our actions. And when you do the evaluation, Madam Presiding Officer, Councillor Devines mentioned the fact that even Grenada has a code of conduct at the level of their parliament. When you look at the UK, Australia, Canada, and a number of other countries, codes of conduct exist to determine how members of the House should operate inside and outside of this House. And of course, I am understanding of the fact that some members of the other side, they feel uncomfortable when they hear the word conduct. And I understand that. But at the end of the day, we in Tobago must recognize that it cannot be business as usual. And therefore, I am sincerely proud of my leader. And as a matter of fact, I have greater respect for the man. Because the man said, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 months ago, that one of the first things I will ensure being elected as Chief Secretary is to ensure that there is a code of conduct that governs the behaviors of members of the Assembly. And here we are today as the first order of business. The first motion being debated in this House has to do with that code of conduct. And Mr. Charles should be congratulated. But the question has to be asked, because the member for Palatuvia Lansome Speyside spoke about existing laws and spoke about the Integrity in Public Life Act, etc. But who enforces that act? And we'll recognize that the process has to do, first of all, with the Integrity Commission. And under some instances, the Director of Public Prosecutions and even the police can eventually get involved. But I'm saying at the level of this Assembly, each of us must be accountable to this House. And therefore, I want to make some suggestions. Because there exists, according to the standing orders, which the member of Roxburgh de la Ford went into in great detail, there's a privileges committee. And privileges, in my opinion, has to do with ensuring that the members in this House do not abuse the privileges that we have when we give contributions in this House. And therefore, under those circumstances, members can be brought before that committee. But I want to suggest that it must go beyond privileges inside of this House. It must go into general behaviors, into general conduct of members of this Assembly outside of this House, in your offices, in your electoral district, even in your divisions for those who are secretaries and assistant secretaries, how you relate to the media, how you relate to your constituents, etc. All those things must form part of the code of conduct. And therefore, I want to suggest that maybe instead of just a privileges committee, we should have a privileges and standards committee. And therefore, it's not only about abusing the privileges inside of this House, but that committee must also deal with potential misbehaviors outside of this House. Secondly, Madam Presiding Officer, I am suggesting as well that there should be sanctions being a part of this code of conduct. Because yes, you have the Integrity in Public Life Act. Yes, there exist some sanctions. But I'm saying the processes, of course, we all know, takes almost forever. And I'm saying, and I'm just going to give an example. For example, you can have a sanction being, maybe members might be required to give an apology if they break the code. A member might be required to give a written apology or a verbal apology in this House. Or it may go to the extent of suspension from the House, Madam Presiding Officer. But I'm suggesting that there must be serious sanctions so that at the end of the day, members within this House must understand that the manner in which we conduct ourselves is in fact important, especially in a society that is going down the way in which it is going down today, Madam Presiding Officer. But even as we discuss the code of conduct, of course, the issue of crime, the minority attempted to bring that up. And of course, we recognize those challenges. We understand the importance of us dealing with those challenges. But I'm saying we have to start at the head. We have to start with ourselves right in this House to ensure that we observe the principles of good governance, the principles of transparency, and the principles of integrity, Madam Presiding Officer. So I am in total support of this code of conduct. And of course, some of the other advantages are it will provide guidance on ethical issues and an improved framework. Because a number of times, new assemblymen, new councillors, we come into office. And we don't have much to refer to in terms of guidance. Yes, again, there is the Integrity in Public Life Act, which is very broad. Again, it is the law of the land, and therefore there are no specifics. And of course, you have the standing orders, which speaks to how we conduct ourselves in the House. And then you have the THA Act, which gives us some guidance there as well. As a matter of fact, it tells us that secretaries, the chief secretary, and the presiding officer cannot have any other form of employment, but assistant secretaries can have, etc., etc. But there are no real specifics. A code of conduct, Madam Presiding Officer, can also satisfy community expectations and build political trust. Because, of course, we hear time and time again where our residents, our constituents, they have very little faith and very little trust in politicians generally in this country. And we must begin to signal our intent to, first of all, hold each other accountable, hold each other to the highest ethical and moral standards, Madam Presiding Officer. And of course, finally, it will build the confidence in this institution called the Tobago House of Assembly. And again, I want to deal with the issue of accountability. Because if we as members in this House can hold each other accountable, then maybe administrators in the Tobago House of Assembly will begin to hold their subordinates more accountable. And then the accountability, Madam Presiding Officer, should go down the line, where heads of departments will begin to hold their staff more accountable. And I'm saying at the end of the day, a number of the issues we experience here in Tobago has to do with a lack of accountability. And therefore, I am sincerely proud to be a part of this administration that is signaling to the people of Tobago and that is signaling to even the people of Trinidad and Tobago that here in Tobago it will not be business as usual. But we intend to change the way we operate. We intend to hold the members of this House accountable. The Chief Secretary intends to hold his secretaries and assistant secretaries accountable. And by extension, we intend to hold our administrators in the divisions accountable. So as I close, I want to demonstrate my support for this motion and my support for increased accountability and increased integrity in the Tobago space and by extension, the Trinidad and Tobago space. I thank you.
Good evening to the House. It is indeed an honor that I stand here having a voice for all of Tobago. When I read the order paper, coming from an academic background, I asked myself, why do we need a code of conduct? After having done a lot of research, and yes, like members in the majority, I identified the fact that there are codes of conduct all over the world, sure. But one of the things that came forward was the fact that codes of conduct are usually created when there is an absence of a law or regulation to influence the individuals or the group or the institution that the code should affect. So, I asked myself, is it that the code of conduct for the Tobago House of Assembly, is it that there are no other laws or regulations available to influence the actions, to influence the behavior, to influence those of us who are sitting in this house? I thought back. And I went back to the oath of office that was taken less than 2 weeks ago by each and every one of us standing in this same house. And please allow me to read verbatim what some of that includes. Madam Presiding Officer, the oath of office for assemblymen says specifically that the assemblymen will, and I quote, uphold the Constitution and the law and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the duties thereof. Madam Presiding Officer, the oath taken by the Chief Secretary, the secretaries, the assistant secretaries, in addition to upholding the Constitution and the law, also says that individuals in those offices are to, and I quote, do right to all manner of people without fear or favor, affection or ill will. And I repeat, do right to all manner of people without fear or favor, affection or ill will. And in my mind, that already encompasses that we all need to behave in a certain manner, whether we are sitting in this house, whether we are on our feet in this house, or when we are outside representing this house. Madam Presiding Officer, please allow me, based on the comments of previous speakers, to identify key components of the standing orders that are relevant. And I would like to remind the House that according to Section 69 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, that speaks specifically about the standing orders of the Tobago House of Assembly, that they are in fact legal binding documents. And according to Section 69, which speaks about the rules and standing orders, it also specifically says, and I quote, that these rules and standing orders are, among other things, to 1, the regulation and conduct of the proceedings and meetings of the Assembly. 2, the maintenance of order in the chamber of the Assembly. 3, the conduct of debates in the Assembly. 4, and I would draw this one specifically to those who spoke about how we treat with members who do not uphold the rules, the suspension of members in the Assembly. And the last one says specifically, such other matters as the Assembly considers fit. such other matters as the Assembly considers fit. Like my colleagues, because this is the first time that I am having the opportunity to sit in this House, I also spent a lot of time reviewing what is currently written in the standing orders. And given that the Tobago House of Assembly Act says that if there is any other matter that the Assembly considers fit can be placed in the standing orders, then maybe we need to consider amending that document if we do not think that it currently influences our behavior well enough. So again, I asked Madam Presiding Officer, what exactly will the Code of Conduct bring that is not already written in either the standing orders, Acts of Trinidad and Tobago, or the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago? And I am yet to find something that would be written in a code of conduct that has not already been addressed either in the standing orders, other acts of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. May I, Madam Presiding Officer, identify some of the other laws that have not already been spoken about in the House that we can use to treat with members who do not adhere to the laws of the land. The Criminal Offences Act, for example, Chapter 11(1), speaks specifically about the falsification of accounts. And it says, and I quote in Section 9, that any clerk, officer, or servant, whether in the public servants or otherwise, and I am assuming that this covers all of us sitting here, who willfully and with the intent to defraud, removes, conceals, destroys, alters, mutilates, or falsifies any books, paper writing, valuable security, or account which belongs to or is in the possession of the government, and it goes on, is liable to imprisonment. Madam Presiding Officer, the offenses of cheating and fraud are also included in the Criminal Offences Act under Section 7. Madam Presiding Officer, if we are planning to use the Code of Conduct to ensure that individuals behave themselves and that they speak words that are not annoying or obscene in the House, the standing orders already speak to that in the section that deals with content of speeches. And may I add, Madam Presiding Officer, that Section 49 of the Summary Offences Act also speaks, and I quote, to any person who uses any obscene, indecent, or profane language to the annoyance of any resident in a public space can be taken to court because of such. In other words, you know, when the police officers arrest you for cussing, this is what they are using. Madam Presiding Officer, the Tobago public is hurting. As you are aware, the levels of crime seems to be escalating. I was also surprised when I saw that a car was stolen in the heart of town in broad daylight today. I know individuals who are yet to be paid for the year. Yes. I know individuals whose family members have died because of less than stellar health care. Madam Presiding Officer, unlike the member for Blackrock, for example, who seems to be stating that he decided very early that this is something that he is going to put forward, I have spoken to individuals who are within my constituency, and I like to call it Belgarden, Goodwood, and a little bit of Mount St. George. Yes. And yes, I did say my constituency, Belgarden, Goodwood, and a little bit of Mount St. George. And I asked them if this is something that is important to them. And they have said to me, Dr. Faith, no. There are issues that are way more important than a code of conduct. In fact, one of those members called me the other day, and he said, Faith, I'm looking for rice. I said to him, what do you mean you're looking for rice? He said, Faith, I've gone to several groceries, and we cannot find rice.
Wow.
And I said to myself, there are so many other things that are of importance to the people of Tobago. For example, I don't know, maybe that lack of rice is as a result of the super-fast Galicia not being able to dock in the port in Port of Spain because there are cruise ships sitting there.
Wow.
I do not know. Madam Presiding Officer, as I said at the beginning, a code of conduct is really only applicable when there are no other laws and regulations binding the actions of individuals. As my colleagues said, we are all adults in this house. If we want to behave, we will behave. If we do not want to behave, there is nothing on a piece of paper that will make us behave. Those of us on my side have decided that we are adults, and Madam Presiding Officer, we will behave in this house. And by the way, Madam Presiding Officer, I am yet to hear anyone speak about the regulatory body that will monitor and ensure compliance with this code of conduct. In the end, Tobagonians are hurting. Some of us are hungry, some are starving. Tobagonians have not been paid. Tobagonians do not have the luxury of job security. Right now, Tobagonians need representatives who would serve their needs. And Madam Presiding Officer, I personally believe, and having spoken with individuals who I represent, I believe that spending the next 3 months of my life sitting on a committee to create a code of conduct is not a good use of my time or of our efforts. In fact, Madam Presiding Officer, I would have thought that given the absence of a minority in the House for the last 4 years, and given the absence, if I am not mistaken, and I stand to be corrected, of the absence of a public accounts committee for many more years, I was hoping that the first debate would be used to facilitate creating such a committee that would hold the THA accountable. And by the way, Madam Presiding Officer, for the benefit of those who may not know, the Public Accounts Committee, according to section, if I'm not mistaken, 77 of the Standing Orders, is responsible for, and I quote, examining, considering, and reporting on, 1, accounts showing the appropriation of sums granted by the Assembly to meet public expenditure, 2, other accounts of the Assembly, and 3, the report of the Auditor General on such accounts. In other words, examining, considering, and reviewing how this Assembly spends taxpayers' money. In the mind of average Tobagonians, Madam Presiding Officer, these issues are way more important than having a piece of paper tell us that we should be polite to each other. Remember, Madam Presiding Officer, there are over 35,000 adults who either voted against or did not vote for the members on the majority. And we stand here in this House giving those individuals a voice to raise the issues that are of concern to the people of Tobago. Madam Presiding Officer, acting at the request of members who I represent, which includes, and I like to call it, Belga and Goodwood, and a little bit of Mount St. George, and the wider Tobago, I cannot and I will not support in principle using the Assembly's time and the Assembly's effort to sit and form a committee to prepare a code of conduct when there are many other priority issues for the Tobago people. I must say, however, that if the members of the majority feel that they need a code of conduct to tell them how to behave, then sure, we are willing to sit and facilitate that process. Thank you.
Secretary of Community Development.
Madam Presiding Officer, members of this Honorable House. Indeed, I join the numbers of members around the table for whom today this is my maiden presentation in the House. I want to first thank God for giving me this opportunity to be of service to the people of Tobago. And I would also like to thank all the members of this august body for affording me the privilege of speaking during the first sitting of this 2017-2021 session. Madam Presiding Officer, this motion, which calls for clearly defined standards of behavior for assemblymen, seeks to bring ethics back into government. And for that, I would like to take the opportunity to heartily congratulate our Chief Secretary, Honorable Kelvin Victor Charles, because he has stated very early, and you have heard it many times before this afternoon, that as we sit in the Assembly, it is not business as usual. As a matter of fact, he prides himself on saying to us, it is business unusual. And Madam Presiding Officer, members of this House, this is something that sends a clear signal to all of us, not just the members of the Assembly, but the people of Tobago, and by extension Trinidad and Tobago, that he is willing to make a change, a positive change. And he recognizes the importance of starting at the top. So for that, Madam Presiding Officer, I would like to again take the opportunity to congratulate our Chief Secretary, Honorable Kelvin Charles. Madam Presiding Officer, almost every major professional organization has developed a code of conduct which sets out its values, ethics, and responsibilities, which guides the standard of behavior and performance of all its members. And included in those major organizations are the Teaching Service, the Public Service Association. So it is passing strange to me that members on the other side of this House seems to find a problem with establishing a code of conduct in the Tobago House of Assembly. I have heard it described as unnecessary, superfluous at this present time. And it worries me because these are the persons that we have elected, that have been elected into office, not only to represent their constituencies, but to represent all of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam Presiding Officer, it seems to me that at this point in time, since the Tobago House of Assembly has been without a code of conduct for so long, it is imperative that we get on board as soon as possible. Madam Presiding Officer, the term honorable is usually ascribed to members of Parliament and in some cases to members of the Tobago House of Assembly. When we think of the word honorable, it is usually a title of respect that is ascribed to some high-ranking official in a country. Madam Presiding Officer, permit me at this time to quote two definitions of the term honorable as outlined in some of our major dictionaries. The Cambridge Dictionary defines honorable as honest and fair, deserving of praise and respect. Collins Dictionary defines honorable as possessing or characterized by high principles worthy of esteem. And these qualities, Madam Presiding Officer, are not qualities that can be regulated by law. I have been hearing around the room all afternoon, laws, standing orders, etc. But when we propose a code of conduct, it is intended to affect the individual on a personal level. And this is something that a law will not do. We are anticipating higher levels of behavior and higher levels of service to the people. We are anticipating that the code of conduct would guide us as members as we try to ensure that our integrity is intact. In Trinidad and Tobago, our Parliament has adopted two sets of code of ethics. And these were presented on the 1st of July 1988 and approved on the 15th of July 1988. And it's interesting that these codes were, or should I say this motion, was moved by a fellow Tobagonian, the Honorable A.N.R. Robinson. And what that says to me, members of this Honorable House, is that being Tobagonian gives us a special place in the affairs of governance in Trinidad and Tobago. And I really believe that the code of ethics that we are hoping to instill in this Honorable House is one that says more than anything else that we as Tobagonians understand that we must continue leading the charge as far as good governance in Trinidad and Tobago is concerned. Madam Presiding Officer, now that sittings of the Parliament are being televised publicly, the general public and the world at large are witnessing firsthand the rampant disorder, discord, and disrespect that passes for debate in the House, sometimes the lower and the upper house. And this dissonance at the seat of power in our country is providing an inaccurate image of who we are as a people. And it sets unacceptable standards of behavior for the impressionable young people in our nation. It is therefore imperative that here in the Tobago House of Assembly, we continue setting and adhering to established codes of conduct for members within this assembly. Madam Presiding Officer, permit me to quote from an article in Transparency International dated the 19th of July, 2012, under the heading, calling out public officials on corruption. According to people around the world, political parties and parliaments are among the top institutions that are the most prone to corruption. Perceptions of corruption have been consistent across time and countries, signaling a systematic mistrust on the part of citizens in the bodies that are supposed to represent them. And Madam Presiding Officer, I speak this without any form of remorse or regret, because it means that we as a people must look internally at all of ourselves before we can look externally. And the quote continues. In a recent poll conducted by Roy Morgan in Australia to examine public attitudes to the behavior of parliamentarians, it was revealed that only 7% of these people believe that members of parliament displayed high standards of honesty and ethics. Madam Presiding Officer, trust in public officials is at an all-time low. Disillusionment with the conduct of government officials, including the Tobago House of Assembly, has been a feature of public discussion for a very long time. And if we are truthful with ourselves, even during this last election, this was a big talking point. So, Madam Presiding Officer, through my readings, I have realized that one source of support that has found favor with the population, not just here in Trinidad and Tobago, but in other parts of the world, is developing and adopting and enforcing a code of conduct that reflects the community's expectations. And this, more than anything else, is the reason that I openly support the urgent need, not just the need, but the urgent need for a code of conduct in the Tobago House of Assembly. Codes of conduct strive to decrease corruption and increase accountability. I have heard the member for Buku, Mount Pleasant, articulating on how important accountability is. And to the members on the other side, I want to take this opportunity to implore you to assist us in supporting this motion, because you yourselves will come to a place where accountability is important. And the Code of Conduct gives the community the opportunity to examine the standards that are set and to see whether or not the noble, honorable members of this House are true to form. In winding up a debate, or should I say being the last speaker, it's always difficult to bring new information to the fore. But some things are worth repeating. The Chief Secretary said a couple hours ago that the purpose of a code of conduct is not to control the behavior of parliamentarians. And I want to repeat it again, especially for our colleagues on the other side. A code of conduct is not to control the behavior of parliamentarians, but rather, and I quote, it is to set public standards by which the behavior of parliamentarians can be assessed. It is to provide a basis for assessing proposed actions and so guiding, not controlling, behavior. It provides an agreed foundation for responding to behavior that is considered unacceptable. I heard the member for Buku Mount Pleasant talk a while ago about sanctions. And built into any code of conduct must be sanctions. It also helps to assure and reassure the community that we serve, that the trust that is placed in us as assemblymen is well placed. So, members of this honorable house, I too, like so many others, would like to remind you of the oath that we took just a few weeks ago. I heard the counselor on the other side read to you a while ago the oath of allegiance that we took. She also read a little bit of the oath that secretaries were given. And I want to endorse that those oaths are covenants that we are making with the people, a covenant to be the best that we can be, so that we can set the example that so many people are expecting from us. Madam Presiding Officer, as public officials, we owe it to God, we owe it to the people who voted us into office, we owe it to ourselves, and most importantly, we owe it to the thousands of young people who are following us on Twitter and Facebook, who are looking at our interactions daily on Facebook. And I urge honorable members of this House, not only should the code of conduct be specifically for what happens in your public life, but I really want to implore that that code of conduct carries over into our personal and professional life. Madam Presiding Officer, members of this honorable House, I want us to prove to all of Tobago and Trinidad and Tobago that the term honorable is not just a title, but it really depicts who we are as assemblymen. The design of this code of conduct is going to be very critical, because not only must it show clear ethical standards of behavior, but it must also be a reference point where so that citizens can use it to assess our behavior. And once this is combined with penalties for public officers, we will find that we are in a better place than we are in today. But, Madam Presiding Officer, the effectiveness of this code of conduct depends on the political will of all of us to ensure that we abide by every aspect of this code. We must also be prepared to support them, and not only to provide sanctions, but I want to also add rewards. Even the best designed code of conduct can fall short if we are not willing to subscribe to and enforce them from the top down. But the very action by our Chief Secretary, Honorable Kelvin Charles, assures us that he is willing and able to enforce it from the top down. Now, we are all familiar with the saying by most people that politicians, before they come into the House, they are honest, law-abiding, ethical citizens. And when they get in here, all of a sudden, they change and they become something else. Madam Presiding Officer, I want to refute this claim a bit, because I am convinced that people do not change. What I do believe is that when people come into public office, it gives them more opportunity to show their true character. And this for me, Madam Speaker, this for me, Madam Presiding Officer, is one of the reasons that I am prone to support this code of conduct, because it is a check balance against us as we come into office, so that we do not fall prey to what so many before us have fallen prey to, but that there is some regulated body of rules which helps us to check ourselves as we move forward politically. Our young people are crying out for leaders of integrity who can see themselves as true models of integrity. People who are willing to be honest and to be selfless, and who can genuinely offer them the guidance and support that they need at this time. Madam Presiding Officer, members of this Honorable House, the ball is now in our court. Let us make the best use of the next 4 years that we are in office. 4 years is a relatively short time to change behavior, but I honestly believe that it can happen one step at a time. Let us be willing to show the people of Tobago that we can serve them and serve them to the best of our ability. Let that service be summed up in 3 short phrases. Let us love and respect God. Let us love and respect ourselves. And let us love and respect others. I heard members around the room expounding on the Word of God, members on our side and members on the other side. And you know, this is very admirable because it is important to know the Word of God. But more importantly, I want to encourage all of us to know the God of the Word. Because if we do that, I honestly believe that many of the problems that we face here in Tobago at this time would soon become less or even a thing of the past. Madam Presiding Officer, as I conclude, I wish to wholeheartedly support the motion laid by the Honorable Chief Secretary, Mr. Kelvin Victor Charles, that this House should appoint a special select committee to prepare a code of conduct for consideration and approval. I support the tenet that this committee should report to the House no later than May 2017. And I also support the fact that this committee should comprise of 3 members from the majority, 2 members from the minority, and I'm silently hoping that these 2 members from the minority would be the representative for Speyside, Palatavere, as well as the representative for Roxborough, Delaford. Madam Presiding Officer, members of the Tobago House of Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Member for Blackbrook Spring Garden.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, as I stand to wind up this debate, let me take this opportunity to commend those of us on the majority side who would have contributed to this debate. I sat there and I wondered, because I said to myself, if these members in the main were in fact making their maiden contribution, and they did it with such aplomb, and such confidence, such competence, such quality, you can imagine, Madam Presiding Officer, when we get into full oratorical flight, what is going to happen? So I applaud the members on this side. Madam Presiding Officer, fortunately, I am not in a combative mood this evening. And therefore, in responding to some of the comments made by the members opposite, I shall be kind. But let me begin with the minority leader, and at least I would commend him for recognizing the value of the motion. His only regret was that it was not an urgent matter. But of course, he does recognize its import and for that I commend him. But even as I do that, I take the opportunity, Madam Presiding Officer, to advise him that he has a responsibility as leader to mentor and coach his younger colleagues and to let them know that, as the Bible says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. And therefore, this motion, as much as it is important for us to recognize that our physical needs are essential, there is need for a context, both as a driver for and as a basis for action. And a spiritual grounding and moral and ethical grounding is an essential feature of life, and particularly of governance. So that I urge the minority leader to please take that responsibility and provide coaching for your young members so they begin to understand, as I just said, there are many facets of life, but a spiritual grounding is particularly important. And that is why we were told, those of us who would have gone to Sunday school, that our houses must be built on solid rocks rather than on shifting sands. If I were to respond, Madam Presiding Officer, and of course I said I'll be kind, to the member for Palatavere, Speyside, Palatavere, Lands for me, Speyside, he made reference to Satan and Satan's attempting Jesus Christ. But what he didn't tell us is that Satan failed miserably in his attempt to tempt Jesus Christ. And of course, I would also wish to respond to the member and to advise him or remind him that the rule of law prevails in this country, and notwithstanding his attempt to debunk the validity of the motion by reference to a number of laws and saying that persons should be locked up and punished, I want to remind him that one of the things that those who are charged in this country for any crime is that they have the opportunity to be bailed, to get bailed. The only crime, I think, or one of the few crimes that one can commit and get away, and is not allowed bail, I think, is murder. But for most of the other crimes, they can get bail. But we on this side are particularly convinced that there ought to be a strong ethical and moral foundation in respect of the governance process, because our experiences would have taught us it is easier to do wrong than right. Somewhere I think I would have read that broad is the road that leads to destruction, filled with temptation, but narrow is that path that leads to righteousness. I am beginning to think, Madam Presiding Officer, that I really should take seriously the whole question of pastorship. But I'll see how that goes. So we are convinced that raising public awareness and promoting values are valuable, extremely valuable, as means to prevent corruption. We are also convinced that corruption represents a very serious threat to the rule of law, democracy, human rights, equity, and social justice, and that it hinders economic development and all its implications and unintended consequences, the ability to put food on the table, and endangers the stability of our democratic institutions, and certainly the moral and ethical foundations of our society. And indeed, we have a responsibility as adults to train our younger ones. In fact, I think it is the Bible that says, train up the child in the way he should go, so that when he's old, he should not depart therefrom. And, Madam Presiding Officer, as a member of the People's National Movement, I think it is well known that the party is one of those parties that is a signatory to a political code of conduct. And in fact, at the level of the Tobago House of Assembly elections, this party was also a signatory to a political code of conduct. Madam Presiding Officer, we on this side are also demonstrating our level and degree of magnanimity. And that is why we would have suggested the kind of proportional representation, or perhaps adverse proportional representation, in respect of the composition of the committee. Because we were suggesting that 66 2/3% of those represented on the other side be part of this committee, whereas less than 1/3 on this side to be part of the committee. Such is our commitment to embrace and to take the opportunity so that we can forge the kind of partnership, notwithstanding our differences in political aspirations and perhaps political thought, so that at the end of the day, the average citizen resident in Tobago would be the beneficiary of a very sound and progressive development process or path for Tobago. And as I was making the point when I started again, we are about building a society in particular ways, and I ask those on the other side, please ensure that when you are weighed in the balance, you are not found wanting. Madam Presiding Officer, it was N. Preston, in his book, Ethics for the Public Sector, 1994, page 1, that stated, and I quote, "Nothing is more dangerous to the well-being of the body politic," and we heard the leader of Assembly Business and Secretary for Infrastructure, Quarries, and the Environment made reference to that. Nothing is more dangerous to the well-being of the body politic than a public official who is or may be technically competent or strategically astute, but ethically illiterate or unfit. And Preston was really, in fact, signaling or making the point that it's all good and well for us to have our various degrees of competencies. But at the end of the day, if we are engaged in public functions, but we lack the moral and spiritual values required for us to execute our responsibilities, then woe be unto the body politic. So, Madam Presiding Officer, as I indicated, we are on the threshold of history. I urge those on the other side that when the account of our stewardship is being assessed, that when the history of this term would have been written, let it be said that they rose to the occasion and they joined with the majority and did their part. Madam Presiding Officer, with these comments, I say to all of us, let's do this together.
Members, the question being proposed shall be, whereas at present there is no specific code of conduct for members of the Tobago House of Assembly, and whereas members of this House have a responsibility to engage in conduct that will not bring the House into odium and disrepute, and whereas members of this House are likely to be subjected to greater scrutiny by members of the public with respect to the governance process of our island, be it resolved that this House appoint a special select committee to prepare a code of conduct for consideration and approval. Be it further resolved that this committee report to the House no later than May 2017. And be it further resolved that this committee comprise 3 members of the majority and 2 members of the minority, and that it be chaired by the leader of Assembly business. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All against, say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The motion is carried.
Madam Presiding Officer, I move that this House be adjourned to a date to be named.
The question proposed is that this House be adjourned to a date to be named. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All against say no. This House stands adjourned.